Well, I got a whole family here. Looks like we got 2 generations here, I assume. Do you know what a generation is?
Not really.
What generation are you part of?
I was born in 2004, so I'm Gen Z.
Gen Z, okay. If they're Gen X, you're probably gender... Hey, we're trying to film video here. Generation Z then, probably?
Yeah.
Zoomer?
Yeah, Zoomer.
I'm in the generation that is too worried about their hair being messed up to get on a video.
I think that's every generation except for Generation Alpha. You said you're Generation X, so are there stereotypes for your generation?
Well, I think sometimes, like, maybe a stereotype about our generation is that we were a little cynical.
What do you think of when you hear that term boomer?
Old people.
They tend to be more older, narrow-minded a little bit.
Maybe a little technology adverse.
They don't know how to use technology.
Old, homeowner, Social Security, money, mostly.
They've made society to where we can't succeed in the future. In my opinion.
I'm glad I'm not a boomer. Okay.
I think the stereotype of millennials is that they tend to be a little more lazy. They want everything to be warm and fuzzy and feel good, and that's at least a stereotype.
So what about millennials then?
A little cringy sometimes.
They try too hard to be cool. Yeah.
You sound like my daughter.
You make really weird TikToks.
Some millennials have some pretty interesting memes. It's the same thing with boomers. They have interesting memes as well, I would say.
I'd think of like Disney automatically, like, you know, like Disney adults.
And Harry Potter.
Yeah, Harry Potter. I love Harry Potter, but still I feel like, you know, yeah. I don't think they're bad people or anything, but...
Are there stereotypes that you think of for your generation?
We're seen as like not as grateful as other generations.
They seem to really want to push like DEI stuff or just in general like cultural programs.
We haven't thought too much about Gen Z. We kind of group them with the other ones, I think, a lot.
What about Gen Alpha then, the youngins? Any stereotypes there?
The iPad generation, right?
Addicted to the iPad.
Yeah, they like can't read.
I can say the longest word in the Oxford Dictionary.
Okay, go ahead. What is it?
Pneumono ultramicroscopic silicovolcanoconiosis.
There you go. There you go. Generation Alpha.
The world is becoming so complicated with so many details and technological subjects that it's hard to keep up with it. And yet, if you listen carefully, somewhere along the line, people are learning how to deal with that.
Breaking everybody up into generations is kind of silly because everybody is his own person. You are who you are. So why are you throwing them in a pool?
Yeah, we don't know why that's ever started.
I don't know why it started.
Generation after generation after generation.
Do you know which generation you're a part of? I'm Mr. Beat, and I'm a millennial, which means I was born approximately between the years 1981 and 1996. I'll let you guess which one of those years I was actually born in. No, wait. Stop guessing. Anyway, there are currently around 10,000 people in the world who don't know about the rest of us. These humans are often referred to as uncontacted peoples. They live independently and almost completely cut off from the rest of the world. There are more than 100 tribes of uncontacted peoples willingly living in isolation. Some, in fact, get aggressive when outsiders try to make contact. On November 17th, 2018, an American named John Allen Chow paid some local fishermen to take him to visit some uncontacted peoples known as the Sentinelese, who live on the isolated North Sentinel Island, located here. Chow was a missionary who wanted to convert the Sentinelese to evangelical Christianity. They did not welcome him. In fact, they killed him. The Sentinelese are infamous for not only being one of the most isolated groups in the world, but also the most violent if you try to even make contact with them. This is why India has banned any boats from getting any closer than 3 miles to the island. So why did I tell you all this? Well, uncontacted peoples have no idea what generations are. Not only that, they have no need to know what generations are. A generation is all the humans born around the same time and who experienced pretty much the same culture growing up. Specifically, we are talking about social generations. That's the generations most typically bring up today. There's also the more traditional familial generations, or a group of humans all on one level of a family tree. Nah, man, in this video, we're focusing on social generations. Who do you think I am? Genie Vlogger? Sorry, Genie Vlogger. Why do you think we even have this term generation to group people?
Everyone's always looking for commonality, so it's easier to just put a little marker out there. People born between this period and this period, we're just going to group them.
Now, you might be thinking, that's a big group of people. How the heck can you generalize like more than 1 billion people? Well, you can. What do you think about when you hear baby boomer? What's the stereotype?
I feel like they're pretty honest people. They're like brutally honest.
Not say like stuck in their views, but they stand by their views.
Hard-nosed.
Pretty evident.
Stubborn.
What about Generation X?
I always think of like X Games, 90s, 80s kids, latchkey, kind of on your own.
Millennials are more like the hipsters, the have tattoos on their like arms. Gen Z is more like they'll have more like obscure tattoos. Millennials like skinny jeans. Gen Zers like the like straight. We're both wearing the like appropriate jeans for today.
Okay, stereotypes aside, there are distinct, easy to identify characteristics of generations. But first, a disclaimer. Please remember that these are generalizations and that there are exceptions to overall generational differences. The root cause of all generational differences is technology. Technology, for the most part, keeps marching forward. At least it has for the past few hundred years anyway. It generally keeps making our lives easier. It generally keeps helping us have more freedom. The more technology, the better our lives have become. For the most part. But more importantly, technology has changed how younger people live their lives compared to older people. It has caused societies to become more and more individualistic, more and more equal, and more open to change. Technology has also made it take longer for us to grow up and longer for us to grow older. In other words, technology has not only extended our lives, but slowed our lives down. Okay, so let's go back to the Sentinelese people. The Sentinelese and other uncontacted peoples have generally not embraced technology. Their day-to-day lives today are more or less the exact same as they were 500 years ago. Sentinelese parents aren't worried that their kids are spending too much time on their phones or wearing weird clothes or listening too much to jazz music. These are generational differences. The main thing I want you to get out of this video is that generations and generational differences are indeed real. They are not just stereotypes. Still, if someone is making assumptions about how one entire generation is, not based on reality, sure, that's a stereotype. I mean, it's nothing new at all for older people to have negative perceptions about younger people, and for younger people to have negative perceptions about older people. As George Orwell famously said, quote, "Every generation imagines itself to be more intelligent than the one that went before it, and wiser than the one that comes after it."
Children across the planet are seemingly becoming obsessed with online content across different platforms, and many parents are fearing that there are dire and long-lasting psychological side effects to this obsession. Teachers across the country have been coming out about this generation and their lack of respect and basic learning skills, and parents have been seemingly perplexed as to why their kids don't listen to them or act like normal children have in the past.
I feel like they don't have time to necessarily think for a second before they're already, I want to play a game. I want to do this.
Yeah.
I want to do this.
Yeah.
And it's like their
attention span is
their attention span is...
Well, they're used to just instant gratification. Yeah. Like when they're playing on the iPad, you just instantly get rewarded. Yeah.
I oddly think of entitled. They usually complain about millennials being entitled, but yet they're like the generation that grew like the government a lot more.
We're hosting an exchange student right now, and she's Gen Z, and there are things that she doesn't remember. So like millennials have all of these conveniences and things that are available to them, but they are closer to a time when that wasn't there, so they remember it more and they can identify with that more. Whereas I think like our exchange student, everything is just super easy, snap of a button, and she's never known a world where it doesn't work that way.
See what I mean? Generations exist because, for the first time in human history, there are cultural differences between people born at different times. It's why people are aging more slowly. It's why women now seek higher education more than men. And sadly, generational differences have led to an increase in ageism, or viewing or treating someone badly based on assumptions about their age. Now, I should say that traditionally, social scientists have said that a big cause of generational differences was major events. The first social scientists didn't even say that social generations were a thing until the 1800s. The French philosopher Émile Littré, okay, it's a French pronunciation, I'm sorry, was the first dude to describe social generations, simply saying it described, quote, all people coexisting in society at any given time. That was in 1863. Jump ahead to the 1920s, and now smart people who call themselves sociologists, or people who study how humans behave in society, were studying generations a lot more. One sociologist, a Hungarian named Karl Mannheim, wrote that people in the same generation experienced the same big events while they were young, and that they were bonded by such common big events. In fact, the first generation, widely talked about by normies around that time, was the lost generation, which describes the group of people who came of age or became adults during World War I. Sociologists would later call the greatest generation people who came of age during World War II. They would say baby boomers would bond due to all coming of age during the Vietnam War. Fears of nuclear war would bond Gen X. 9/11 would bond millennials. And the COVID-19 pandemic would bond Gen Z. However, lately it has become apparent that people born in the same generation have not been bonded by major events in the same way. Other sociologists realized that the development of generations actually didn't coincide neatly with major events, but rather, you guessed it, technology, baby. You might be wondering, wait a second, how can generations be a fairly new thing if technology has been around since the earliest humans have roamed the earth? After all, fire is a form of technology.
Yeah, fire! 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 Fire!
Well, it's because only over the past 200 years or so, basically since the first industrial revolution, has technology moved at a much higher pace to a point where parents who didn't grow up with a certain pervasive technology never could get fully comfortable with it. Pervasive just meaning the technology is freaking everywhere. Think about your grandma who has trouble sending you a text message. Think about how you freak out if you don't have your phone to navigate to a new place when your grandpa has no problem whatsoever navigating to a new place. The fact is, the world is rapidly changing. If you grow up being able to travel back and forth to the moon, but your mom didn't, your mom sure as heck would be terrified to travel to the moon. Now, generations may be real, but they were still made up by humans. Like, say you were born in the year 1996. Oh, you were? That's cool. What a coincidence. Well, according to different people, you may be considered a really young millennial or a really old zoomer. In fact, you may identify with both. What do you identify with more?
Both. I feel like I have the mannerisms of a millennial, but the anxiety of a Gen Zer.
The best of both worlds. That's because sociologists and others who study this stuff continue to debate about the specific dates. But hey, kid, take my advice. You don't want to step into a big pile of poop. Generally speaking, there are still generational patterns. What I'm about to say may likely shock you. Are you ready for this? Are you sitting down? Oh, okay. Well, looks like most of you are sitting down. That works out. But yeah, this shocked me when I first read it. When you were born has a much bigger effect on who you are than your family who raised you. Well, at least according to this book anyway. Welcome to the Jungle Punks. In this video, we're going to look at the generational differences of every generation going back to the lost generation. Okay, so some folks have come up with generations before the lost generation, going as far back as the 1400s, but to be honest, I'm not the biggest fan of these, since these generations all revolve around what's going on in just a few countries and downplay technology. Okay, so floating on the funk, so get your groove on. Here are the major differences between the generations, at least in the Western world, or those parts of the world. Yes. Have you heard of the Lost Generation?
Yeah, the Lost Generation was like before like the war babies of like world.
Greatest Generation, yeah.
Yeah, the Greatest Generation. I guess you don't really hear a lot from that group of people.
I'm surprised you've heard of them.
I'd like to think I know my stuff.
Did you watch Mr. Beat videos?
Yes, I do watch Mr. Beat.
As I said earlier, this was the first generation that entered the mainstream, that most people became aware of. It describes people who came of age during World War I. Even though she likely heard the term from somewhere else, the person most often credited with coming up with the phrase Lost Generation was the writer Gertrude Stein. Another writer, Ernest Hemingway, made it even more popular when he included the quote, "You are all a lost generation." In his novel, The Sun Also Rises, it describes the young folks seemingly having no direction in life after experiencing the trauma caused by the war. But sun don't even shine through our window pane. There were technology differences. The Lost Generation was the first generation who grew up with consumerism taking over, mostly due to the fact that it was now way easier to buy stuff. You could just go to a store. Hey, that was still a new thing in the late 1800s and early 1900s. This was mostly thanks to mass production now being the norm for getting goods to people. The Lost Generation was the first one that grew up after the Second Industrial Revolution had already been in full swing, a period that saw dramatic advancements in communications, transportation, modern sewage systems, and access to clean drinking water. They were the first generation to grow up having access to electricity, and the first to have gas and electric lighting in their homes. And finally, they were the first generation to grow up with it becoming more common to go to school and learn how to read. Now, for all the ladies in the cave, I should note that we're only talking about certain parts of the world where the Second Industrial Revolution actually had an effect. They're all dead now. No one from the Lost Generation is still alive. The last known member of this generation died in 2018. Do you have any thoughts on the Greatest Generation? I know it's kind of like bragging, right? We're the Greatest Generation.
The Greatest Generation.
Yeah. What do you know about the Greatest Generation?
The ones that went over there and kicked Hitler's butt. Yeah. That's the one.
Can he say butt?
The greatest was like early depression, early mid-depression, and the war.
Also referred to as the GI generation or World War II generation. The Greatest Generation was just great, man. Great. But no, they came of age during the biggest and most horrific war in human history, World War II. The person most often credited with coming up with the phrase Greatest Generation was the military leader James Van Fleet. In 1953, he famously used the phrase when speaking to Congress, saying, quote, "The men of the 8th Army are a magnificent lot, and I have always said the greatest generation of Americans we have ever produced." The journalist Tom Brokaw later popularized the phrase with his book called, yeah, you probably guessed it, The Greatest Generation. Notice how this generation spans 26 years, longer than all other modern generations. Well, this is because for many of them, World War II put their lives on hold. Sure, the Greatest Generation did save the world from Nazi Germany, but it is also unique in that they came of age during the worst global economic crisis in modern world history, the Great Depression. This is why this generation is often generalized as being particularly frugal and humble. The big inventions they grew up with that their parents did not? Well, now everybody had a phone, for starters. They were also the generation to grow up with cars becoming more common so that it was easier to go longer distances whenever the heck they wanted, meaning they didn't have to wait for a train or a ship or a streetcar. They had the freedom to just go. Heck, they were the first generation to grow up knowing that they could travel in the sky if they wanted to, for goodness sake. Yep, airplanes were increasingly becoming more common. They were the first generation to grow up going to a movie theater to watch movies. The first to grow up listening to the radio. Today, the youngest members of the Greatest Generation are in their late 90s. Most of them are over 100 years old. In fact, there are less than 1 million members of this generation still alive. If you happen to see one, I would talk to them. I mean, you don't have to, but I mean, the silent generation. What do you know about the silent generation?
They're old.
I don't know if I have stereotypes because I have good relationships with the silent generation. Now some of them are not with us as much anymore, so I wonder if some of those stereotypes have also passed.
I feel like it's in the name. They just like suffer in silence. They don't really talk about, they're not as open as their feelings.
Tough to say because I haven't met someone from that generation in like a year or so.
So why does everybody forget the silent generation?
Because they're silent.
They're silent.
A lot of the silent gen are all like nursing home age, so you don't interact with them.
And Joe Biden.
Yeah.
He's technically silent generation. I'm not even joking.
Which is crazy.
You know, we talk about people want to go green nowadays and recycle. They did all that because they had to. And they learned how to reuse things and repurpose things.
They're also known as the traditionalist generation, since many used to say they favored conformity and the status quo. However, I think that label is mostly crap. Some of the most progressive thinkers in world history, many who inspired the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the 1960s counterculture movement, and even rock music, for crying out loud, are from this generation. That said, there is considerable evidence that many from the silent generation are loyal and have deep respect for authority. Time magazine first notably popularized the phrase silent generation in its November 5th, 1951 issue. Quote, "The most startling fact about the younger generation is its silence. By comparison with the flaming youth of their fathers and mothers, today's younger generation is a still, small flame. It does not issue manifestos, make speeches, or carry posters. It has been called the silent generation." The idea of a, quote, teenager as a distinct phase of life became widespread as the silent generation came to age. The big inventions they grew up with that their parents did not? Television, which gave them immediate exposure to world events, cultures, and materialism. The rise of television led to a dramatic decline in reading. The silent generation also came of age during a time when home appliances such as microwaves, washing machines, and refrigerators became very common, making it so that more and more people had the ability to live alone and even had some more time for fun. In Western countries, the silent generation was the first to move in mass numbers to the suburbs. The authors William Strauss and Neil Howe once predicted that the silent generation would be blocked from political leadership by the bigger generations on either side of them, the Greatest Generation and Baby Boomer generation. Well, they were right in terms of American presidents, at least. Joe Biden is the first and probably last silent generation American president. President Joe Biden is a silent generation. He's older than a boomer. That's what I always tell people. Still, members of this generation have had a tremendous impact on society. Less than 100 million members of the silent generation are still alive today.
They set good examples for the baby boomer generation.
What about baby boomer?
It's like, music these days is so bad. Kids don't work like we used to. When I was 18, I'd go work in the coal mines for 12 hours a day.
Baby boomer. What do you think of when you hear baby boomer?
I think about grandpa, right? Baby boomers is like all the two veterans come home and then they're happy they won the war, so they had a lot of children.
Baby boomers are arguably the most famous generation, meaning you've probably heard of them. They came of age during a remarkably prosperous time, a time when the so-called, quote, middle class, or people in the middle of a social hierarchy, often related to how much money and education you have, dramatically grew. That said, it really depends on what part of the world we're talking about here. In China, for example, baby boomers came of age during a particularly chaotic time. So why are they called baby boomers? Well, the phrase baby boom refers to a dramatic increase in the number of babies born during a relatively short time, and boy oh girl did that happen right after World War II. The assumption is that after the war was over, those who had previously held off on starting families now not only all started families at the same time, but really started families, if you know what I'm saying.
After World War II, the guys came back, they settled down, they got married, and they all had families. The majority of them did.
Families. Mm-hmm.
And so babies were born more than any other generation because they were separated for a while.
Wait, why are babies born? No, kidding. Just a bunch of babies were born between 1946 and 1964, okay? The first recorded use of baby boomer was in an article by Leslie Nason in the January 1963 issue of the Daily Press. Today, this generation is simply called boomers, and younger people even say okay boomer when referring to anyone as old and out of touch, not just, actual boomers. Have you ever heard the phrase okay boomer before? Have you heard that?
No.
Oh, good. I'm not even don't even worry about it then. Yeah, it's not nice. My parents are boomers.
I think they're a very hardworking generation.
Yep, that's them. When I tried to interview who I thought were likely boomers on the street, many of them turned me down, so I just interviewed my parents instead. The big inventions they grew up with that their parents did not? Well, air conditioning for starters, which is why so many of them ultimately would move to much warmer climates as adults. As they came of age, birth control was now not only more easily available, but also more socially acceptable, and so boomers were more likely to have premarital sex and have less kids. Also related to this, women in this generation pursued careers dramatically more than women in previous generations. These changes led to boomers also being more confident than previous generations, and thus more ambitious. This was the generation that protested the Vietnam War more than any other, yet also later got associated with the yuppie culture or young urban professional hustle and goal-oriented culture that arose in the 1980s. There is also plenty of evidence that boomers were much more open about their emotions than previous generations. Today, baby boomers are still the generation that holds the majority of power across most of the world. There are around 1.1 billion boomers who walk amongst us. They're beautiful people. You shouldn't be afraid of them. They don't bite. Well, except for my Aunt Susan. She bites. And reality bites.
I lost my job. But you shouldn't have any trouble finding another job, Sugar Booger. No, see, I tried. I applied for every single opening in my field, but there's nothing right now. Well, then I hate to say it, but times are hard. You're just gonna have to swallow your pride.
And what generation am I? 68.
Oh, Generation X. What stereotype do you know about Gen X?
They hate Gen Z.
Why?
Because they think Gen Z hates them. They're kind of forgotten. No one really cares about them.
What about stereotypes for Generation X?
I like Gen X.
That was the generation that went from being committed to a company to being disillusioned.
A lot of them are going through college, entering the workforce. They want to come in at that higher wage.
My parents' age, basically.
I mean, I know my parents are Gen X.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, like traditional. Yeah.
So really cool people. But you said, well, you said traditional. Why traditional?
I feel like all our parents kind of want what they grew up like to happen to us too.
I do have to say, like Gen X's, there had a lot of working females, so I think we had a big boom of women entering the workforce, going to college, and then having to grow up and raise kids. Then we're balancing more of the traditional family kind of structure, but as well as trying to push forward for equity for women.
Though the phrase Generation X has been used to describe the youngest generation in a society for decades before, it came to describe people born between around 1965 and 1980, believe it or not, by this dude. Yep, Billy Idol used the moniker Generation X for his punk rock band. Later, the phrase became mainstream to describe this generation due to the writer Douglas Copeland's novel Generation X: Tales for an Accelerated Culture. Gen Xers are sometimes referred to as the MTV generation, as many of them were heavily influenced by MTV, the first television channel that played music videos all the time. This is the generation that gave us grunge and grew up terrified of nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Gen X is sometimes also referred to as the latchkey generation, rooted in the rising trend of children coming home from school to an empty home and needing their own key to let themselves in. Why were they latchkey kids? Well, because for the first time, both parents were working. Due to this, many in this generation actually came to be much more independent. Gen Xers were children during a time of dramatically increasing divorce rates now that divorce was more socially acceptable. This means Gen Xers came of age more used to split custody between parents. The big inventions they grew up with that their parents did not: the first personal computers, the first video games. This was a big freaking deal, all right. Gen Xers grew up learning how to be way more productive than their parents thanks to computer technology. They grew up with major fears of inflation and command economies, which led them to generally embrace a government that was more hands-off of the economy as adults. There are a little over 1 billion Gen Xers in the world currently. What stereotypes do you think of when you hear the word millennial?
Oh, we had MySpace before Facebook, or we've got little quotes from like tattoos or stuff from like the emo bands in like the mid 2000s. That's kind of what I think of.
MySpace and Tumblr, early YouTube, definitely a connected social generation.
They're very open-minded, that they're willing to like learn things, but they were also like the cusp of all the digital natives.
A lot of like early internet adoption.
Yep, that's me. Although some may say I'm a Xennial, more accurately. More on that in a bit. Millennials originally were known as Generation Y since advertisers just started going up the alphabet to differentiate younger folks from Generation X. The aforementioned authors, William Strauss and Neil Howe, are credited with coming up with the more well-known Millennials label. They used it as the oldest members of this generation, like myself, came of age at the turn of the millennium. You know, the third millennium that we currently live in. People sometimes call millennials echo boomers, as many of them are offspring of baby boomers, like myself. Okay, I'll stop doing that. I know that's getting annoying. Thus, similar to the baby boomer generation, the millennials are a particularly numerous generation. Currently, there are more millennials walking around than any other generation. They're seemingly around every corner. There's a lot of them in particular here on YouTube. There are currently around 1.9 billion millennials in the world. But just because there are so many, that doesn't mean they have much power. Yet, in the United States, millennials have often been called the unluckiest generation because they generally have gone through slower economic growth since entering the workforce compared to any previous generation. The big inventions they grew up with that their parents did not. The internet is the biggest one. This is the first digital native generation, meaning this is the first generation who grew up with the internet in the so-called information age. The first to actively use cell phones and social media. Most millennials always knew a world in which they could look up anything online. Due to this, millennials are generally more open to change compared to previous generations. Many have abandoned the religions they grew up in. Although it arguably started with Gen X, they're the generation who really got into tattoos. According to some reports, nearly half of all millennials have at least one tattoo. Millennials are united by major events, even more so than the generations that surround them. In addition to coming of age during 9/11, many also spent their early years in a crappy job market due to the Great Recession. This was the first generation to be severely hurt by student loan debt and dramatically skyrocketing healthcare, housing, and childcare costs. Related to this, millennials have postponed marriage and have kids much later in life compared to previous generations.
What would you assume is a stereotype about Gen Z?
Sorry, that was my phone. I always have it on silent.
Basically, the influencers of Gen Alpha.
Oh, so millennials are influencers of...
No, we all hate millennials.
You hate me?
We kind of group them with the other ones, I think, a lot.
That's when the social media started.
Yeah.
Oh, that generation started using that a lot and kind of lost out on the one-on-one time with relationships.
Yeah.
Your generation, what do you think is the stereotype?
A lot of like TikTok and YouTube and like digital culture, maybe like more social.
Oh, we're on our phones too much, or oh, Gen Z don't want to work. But I don't think those are necessarily true.
I would say more free-spirited, you know, like we don't want to be tied down to like one specific thing.
The name Generation Z describes them because Z comes after Y in the alphabet, don't you know? And they're the generation after Generation Y, or Millennials. I know, that's kind of boring. Although many call themselves Zoomers, thanks to a 4chan meme, so that's more interesting. A bunch of other people have proposed calling members of this generation everything from iGeneration to NetGen to Post-Millennials, but yeah, I predict none of those will stick around. Gen Z has a better flow, don't you know? Anyway, there is evidence that Zoomers tend to be more aware of mental health conditions compared to previous generations. Gen Z kids were more likely to be diagnosed with intellectual disabilities and mental illness than previous generations. The big inventions they grew up with that their parents did not? The big one is social media. The other big one is smartphones. Zoomers grew up spending lots of time on smartphones, especially during their teenage years. Gen Z is the first generation to grow up in a world where they could instantly access any information anywhere they wanted to. They grew up being much more aware of stuff in general at an earlier age than previous generations. Some sociologists have argued that this has led them to be generally more stressed out, anxious, and depressed than previous generations. Many have argued that they are more cynical at a younger age due to being aware of the world's problems at a much younger age. After all, it was much harder to hide the world's problems from them. They often figured it out on their own. They have coped with this by being big into nostalgia, taking their time, living their lives, and retreating to their own corners of the internet. The majority of the students that I taught in the classroom for 12 years were, in fact, Gen Z. So I think I know this generation fairly well. And I should add that I think this generation is the most intelligent generation yet that the world has ever seen. Gen Z is less populous than you'd think due to their parents, mainly Gen Xers, but also millennials, both waiting longer to have children and having fewer children. There are currently around 1.7 billion Zoomers in the world. You were not born during those years?
No. So I got, I guess, a Gen Zer and a Gen Alpha that I'm raising. I don't really have any stereotypes for them because we're still in developing, so I guess we can mold them a little bit, right?
There's another generation that's after Gen Z, so that's the ones that are the kids now. So what's that generation
Your
called?
children?
Yes. Do you know what they're called?
Negative.
Grandchildren.
Grandchildren, I like that. That's what they are.
The grandchildren generation. You heard it here first. Do they have a stereotype? Generation Alpha?
I feel like theirs is worse than ours. I mean, I don't know. I just see them as a worse version of us. They haven't really proven themselves yet. Got a lot to do.
So are there any stereotypes yet of their generation that you can think of?
Annoying.
Oh my gosh, no, you're not annoying at all.
I don't know, man. I think it's still, still super young to start to make some generalizations.
Gosh, I'd have to think about that one because you only know them as kids.
If you are under the age of 13 or 12 or perhaps 11 or perhaps 10 at the time of the recording of this video, congratulations, you are a member of Generation Alpha. I recorded this video in the year 1635. 2024. What do kids your age all do? What does all your friends do? What's
Play video games.
Somebody earlier said your generation was always on iPads. Are you always on iPads?
We don't even have one. Tablet.
Oh, tablet. Okay.
Samsung tablet.
The name Generation Alpha came from a survey in 2008 by a research company in Australia who apparently was inspired to start naming future generations the way meteorologists name hurricanes. But I'm sure in about 10 years, we'll have a new name for Gen Alpha. Why? Well, because we actually don't know that much about Generation Alpha yet. Those who say they know really don't. Look, we'll know a whole lot more about them once they begin to become adults, which won't be until at least the end of the 2020s. Yeah, my kids are pretty much Gen Alpha. They're great kids. I love them.
The toilet YouTube channel where it's like the guy is like a head, toilet head.
Now, since technology is changing so fast these days, there are now micro-generations between generations, such as Zennials, a mix of the phrase Gen X and Millennial, describes people born between 1977 and 1983. People felt a distinction needed to be made because this group, though comfortable with the internet, also vividly remembers a world without it. There's also Zennials, the generation that overlaps Millennials and Gen Z, born between around 1992 and 1998, who also vividly remember a world before smartphones and social media.
You're actually a Zalpha. You want to explain that? What's a Zalpha?
It's the mix between a Gen Z and Gen Alpha because I'm right on the edge.
Yeah. Which would you rather identify with?
Gen Z, because the stereotype for Gen Alpha is really bad.
Why is the stereotype for Gen Alpha really bad?
because they think they're like Sephora kids who don't know how to read and do like really weird.
Skibbity toilet?
Stop.
Take a look around. As far as I'm concerned, that's it, DJ Lethal. Those were the generations explained. Which is why this video is called Generations Explained. Then again, I may decide later on to change the title of this video to Captain's Drunk, Your World is Titanic. I'm still workshopping it. Keep in mind that in other countries, these generations are often called something else. I'm a bloody American, so I use the American phrases. So go ahead and talk crap. I relied heavily on this book while making this video. I encourage you to check it out as well. The link is in the description. It's called Generations blah, 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 by Dr. Jean Twenge, I think is how you pronounce her name. And in case you were wondering, Throughout this entire video, I was sneaking in lyrics from Limp Bizkit's My Generation. Now you gotta go back and watch and find them. So which generation are you from? Which stereotypes do you associate with all the generations? Do we as a society focus way too gosh darn much on generations? Do I ask too many questions about generations? Let me know down below. Okay, Alpha. Thanks for watching.